Howdy, friends. You're listening to How the West Was Cast, a podcast dedicated to the best of the Western movie genre.
Unenforced law is an invitation to anarchy. Consequently, the Stock Growers Association will now and publicly wipe out these thieves and anarchists. We are employing 50 men on the basis of $5 a day and $50 for every cattle thief shot or hung. We will go to Johnson County. We will depose the incompetent civil authority there, and we will keep possession of the town until we can take charge of the courts. We have placed 125 names on a death list.
That was a scene from Michael Cimino's controversial 1980 Western, Heaven's Gate. And on this special episode of How the West Was Cast, we'll speak with author Charles Elton, who's just published the very first biography of Oscar-winning director Michael Cimino. Hello, my name is Matthew Chernov, and I'm a screenwriter and an entertainment journalist in Los Angeles.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson, a film historian and the chair of the Department of Film and Media Arts at the University of Utah.
Now, Andrew, from the moment we decided to launch this podcast 2 years ago, I have wanted us to do an episode on Heaven's Gate. It's a film that's haunted me for decades, and I consider it an astonishing work of art. From its bold political themes to its technical beauty, Vilmos Zsigmond's gorgeous cinematography, David Mansfield's masterful score. For all its many flaws, it's a film that I think is just a staggering epic that's unlike any other movie I've seen. And because of that, I wanted us to wait until we had an interesting reason to cover it on the show. And this brand new book about Michael Cimino is the perfect excuse for that. I read it a few weeks ago, and it's just a brilliantly written and long overdue look at Cimino's life and career. So what are your thoughts on Heaven's Gate?
Well, I'm not as enthusiastic about the film as you are, but I recognize that it's an important film, not only for the history of the Western, but for the history of American cinema, and maybe more so for the stories we tell ourselves about those histories. You know, I thought maybe, and you can tell me if you think this is a good idea, I might just share the legend, let's say, of Heaven's Gate before we get into our main interview subject for today, just so audiences have an idea. Does that sound good?
Definitely.
All right.
Go for it.
So the legend of Heaven's Gate, which is a legend in that there's some truth to it, but also some falsehood, which we'll get to today, is as follows. Given complete artistic control by United Artists over what was initially envisioned as a modest Western about the Johnson County War, Michael Cimino, the movie's meticulous and temperamental director, went ridiculously over time and budget, shooting 1.5 million feet of film, firing crew members at will, and tearing down $1 million sets for no discernible reason. Cimino first delivered to the studio a 5-hour version of the movie, which he was persuaded to reduce to 3.5 hours. Intended for a prestige road show release, Heaven's Gate was so poorly received that the studio withdrew it at Cimino's request. A 149-minute cut of the movie, released in 1981, fared no better. The movie's failure then contributed, infamously, to the sale of United Artists by Transamerica Corporation to MGM in 1981, effectively, the legend goes, bringing to an end the independent studio founded by Mary Pickford, Charles Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith in 1919. Now, as for me, and you'll know this, I take something of a middle-of-the-road position on Heaven's Gate. The movie is, of course, nowhere near the disaster it was labeled as in 1980, yet, to me, the film is also not the masterpiece it's been described as since the mid-1980s, when the 3.5-hour cut of the film became widely available and reappraisals of the movie began to appear. It was obviously much more difficult to get a Western made after Heaven's Gate, but we need to acknowledge that annual Western production had already dipped to the low single digits by the late 1970s. And as I have said before on the podcast, interest in the Western had little to do with Heaven's Gate being made. The film's producers believed that an Academy Award-winning director was about to deliver them a modern American classic on par with Gone with the Wind. And after all, the war film wasn't a thriving genre in the late 1970s, but look how Apocalypse Now, a similarly self-indulgent, self-destructive auteurist venture of epic proportions, had turned out. Now, Cimino learned a hard lesson with Heaven's Gate, and it was a lesson that Coppola would learn just a few years later when he tried to tackle another seminal yet no longer popular genre with the musical.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. Although I think Charles would take some issue with some of that, particularly the idea that it bankrupted the studio. Although I think you said contributed to instead of, but like, I guess common wisdom is that it bankrupted the studio. It's such an easy thing to say. And it's, according to Charles, as he says in this interview, it's simply not true. That there were a lot of factors involved in what happened to United Artists. Exactly.
And I think that is maybe from a film history perspective, one of the most valuable things that this book does is really dispels the myth that this film was solely or even largely responsible for what happened to United Artists in the 80s.
Yeah. I mean, I get people's problems with this movie. Its length, the pacing is kind of a problem for some people, the lack of a traditional hero in this film. But so much of it works for me, that air of melancholy and regret that all the characters, that seems to weigh on all the characters. I find that very moving. I also just admire the ambition behind this, the foolhardiness. There's like a Fitzcarraldian vibe to Cimino's quest to put this thing on screen. There's also this cautionary tale involved in putting side by side The Deer Hunter with Heaven's Gate. Here is this Oscar-winning epic that people really took to, and you sandwich that right next to Heaven's Gate, which is like this Icarus-like quality where he was, tried to go too far to the sun and just crashed and burned. He didn't really learn the right lessons from his Oscar-winning movie.
Yeah, I mean, he's not alone. Again, Coppola gets very close to the sun with Apocalypse Now and gives him the confidence to make One from the Heart. And that, of course, is in some ways a comparably disastrous attempt to offer audiences an updated, very auteurist take on a seminal Hollywood genre that has fallen out of favor. So he's certainly not alone. One thing I did really appreciate about the book is that it isn't hagiography, that there's an acknowledgement of Cimino's sort of many, many flaws. And I think Elton says this in your interview, that he understands the greatness in Heaven's Gate, but he also recognizes some of its faults, which I think makes it really some of the best stuff that's ever been written about this film.
Yeah, I agree. Cimino comes across, he's a complex figure. We really see that in this book. I both root for him and I keep wincing at some of the mistakes he makes, the way he antagonizes people unnecessarily. He was a bully in a lot of ways, and yet he's also very vulnerable. He comes across as a really complex figure. And there are other characters in this story that are larger than life. His longtime producer, Joanne Corelli, she's a piece of work. The book deals with her a lot and her relationship with Cimino and both as producer and as a muse and a possible girlfriend. She's a striking figure in this tale of Cimino, and her character is just kind of fascinating in this story, I find.
Yeah. No, and she's kind of a mysterious figure, really, really up to this point. So it's really fascinating to have, this kind of part of not only this film, but really Cimino's entire career, his entire life in some respects, or at least a significant portion of it, revealed through a closer inspection of the life of this really kind of interesting woman.
Have you ever shown this film to students or in a film class?
I most certainly have. I've shown it a number of times in my Western film class. I don't always show it, but I have. It's always this calculation of, do I show Heaven's Gate or do I show two other Westerns from around this time, which is, a legitimate calculation that we teachers have to make, but I have shown it. And it's always interesting to teach because there is, on the one hand, so much in there to look at in relation to what the Western had been up to that point. But one thing that I've always really been pleased that students pick up on is the fact that Cimino was clearly not a film buff, was clearly not a lover of Westerns, which distinguishes him from, a Leone or a Peckinpah or an Eastwood, whose films have this really kind of encyclopedic quality to them. Lots of references, lots of engagement with tropes from the genre's history. Cimino isn't that way. He, of course, famously would always say that the Johnson County War was this, somehow obscure story that had never been told in film before, which is, of course, not true. I mean, Shane is basically the Johnson County War. So what's interesting to teach it is kind of dealing with this massive Western made by someone who is kind of atypical and that isn't really a fan, not only of the Western, but maybe isn't that big a fan of movies in general, but has these other interests, some of the things that you and Elton will get into, interests about class or the immigrant story. That makes it an interesting film to talk about, but also kind of explains why the film exists in a way apart from the Western.
That's so true. He doesn't come across as a movie fan when you read this book. He barely seems, he never acknowledges directors that he particularly admired. He wasn't that kind of he wasn't like a De Palma or a Bogdanovich or one of those kind of filmmakers who loved and lived movies. He's really on the outside with that. Although he's not interested in Westerns, though, a lot of the material he was developing were Westerns. The Conquering Horse was a novel that he spent a lot of time developing. His later film Sun Chaser also has a lot of Western Native American themes to it. Mm-hmm. So it was there was something about that time period and the West in general that I think spoke to him, but not Western movies in any way, really.
Yeah, which in some ways makes it more like a Western from the genre's heyday, when it's less about demonstrating your own familiarity with the genre and just recognizing this is a popular genre and it's a genre that different filmmakers can use to tell different types of stories and comment on different types of issues. I mean, for me, the most interesting thing about Heaven's Gate, and something I wish the film had maybe paid a little more attention to, is this idea of playing cowboy. It's actually the rare Western film that it kind of takes a serious approach to this notion of these guys from the East who came out and to a degree are performing particular roles, whether it's the role of the hero or the role of the villain. And this is the film that shows us that there are, consequences to that kind of fantasy. I always think of John Hurt, at the end of the movie as he's walking around, clouded in dust, and he starts talking about, he's been to Paris. He was just in Paris. Where
That's such a sad moment. Yeah,
it is. And then, of course, the film's, very melancholy ending where we see Chris Christopherson, has retreated as far east as you can possibly get, all the way off the coast of the U.S.
Right. Which we talked about in our Wyatt Earp episode. When one of my 5 things about Wyatt Earp was the comparison between the ending of Heaven's Gate with Christopherson on the boat and the end of Wyatt Earp with Earp
looking for a new frontier
in Alaska, or is that where they are? Or
that's where they are.
An interesting little comparison there. So we'll include a link to purchase the Cimino biography in this episode's show notes. But before we hear from Charles himself, I want to share just a little bit of background info on him. So Charles Elton was the director of the Curtis Brown Agency, representing filmmakers in London and Los Angeles. He was also an executive producer of drama at ITV in England, where he was responsible for many award-winning shows. And he wrote 2 novels prior to writing this new biography. And the bio, just because I haven't mentioned the entire name yet, the bio is actually titled Cimino, The Deer Hunter, Heaven's Gate, and the Price of a Vision. And with that said, I think it's time we say hello to Charles Elton. Hello, Charles. It is an honor having you join me today on How the West Was Cast.
Well, it's good to be here.
Now, first of all, congratulations on this book. I've wanted someone to write about Michael Cimino for decades, and I'm so glad you're the one who did it because you just knocked it out of the park. This is exactly the book I wanted to read.
I was lucky that nobody else was doing it. was just pure luck. I'm amazed he died in 2016. I'm amazed nobody's done it. But anyway, I'm glad I did it.
It is shocking that someone so talented, so famous, so controversial, that there hasn't been a real biography of him yet. Why do you think that is?
I think to some extent, his reputation always, unfairly, was like a kind of noose around his neck. You know, it travelled everywhere with him, and it never kind of went away. I mean, luckily, which I go into in the book, his reputation as a filmmaker was restored, mostly in Europe at the end, towards the end of his life. But, you know, Hollywood and the movie industry doesn't care what a few European film critics think about somebody. So it didn't restore his reputation in the movie world, other than with movie buffs, movie people. The industry didn't care. And so he was unfashionable. He was like a kind of pariah. And I think the kind of people who write biographies of movie people would say, you know, he wasn't Robert Altman, he wasn't David Lean, he wasn't quite up there. I mean, he is for me and probably for you, but for lots of people, he's not quite a good enough director to warrant a biography. And the way I looked at it, I mean, I think he's a great filmmaker, though he made some terrible films. But I just thought there is nobody like Cimino in terms of his personality, his reputation, and as a filmmaker. There's nobody like him, and he's a fascinating person. And so obviously I went into the things that made him, both as a person and a creative filmmaker. And I think for some people that's been a surprising way of doing it, that it isn't just like a film book. I mean, if you read a biography, I'm sure you have, of, you know, there's a biography of Alan Pakula, a biography of Sidney Lumet, but those treat them really only as a filmmaker. And I was fascinated by the weirdness of Cimino as a person. So in a way, the book is a cross between a film book and an analysis and a description of a unusual, let's say, person.
One of the things I'm curious about Heaven's Gate is why this particular story? What was it about the Johnson County War that spoke to Cimino, do you think?
I mean, he said that he came across the story of the Johnson County War when he was researching the history of barbed wire. Now, why you would be researching these? I mean, I can see it's sort of interesting, but I'm not sure it's worth a huge amount of time getting into the history of barbed wire, whatever. He said that's how he came across it. But of course, he was a very unreliable narrator about almost everything in his life. And the Johnson County War wasn't as unknown a subject as he sometimes implied. In fact, it's quite famous, the Johnson County War. You know, Frederick Manfred, who, if you're a Western buff, you'll know Conquering Horse and all that. And Cimino, as you know, did a script of Conquering Horse, which I've got. It's a wonderful script. And he knew Frederick Manfred really well. And Frederick Manfred had written a book about the Johnson County War, which Cimino must have seen. So it wasn't like the most unusual thing in the world to come across. But also what Cimino was always interested in was class and immigrants. You know, if you look at the Sicilian, Sun Chaser to some extent, he was always fascinated by immigrants, and he was totally obsessed with class. And the setup, as you know, in Heaven's Gate, these preppy aristo kids who go from the privilege and wealth of East Coast life and Harvard and, you know, Rhode Island or wherever, and go and do something down and dirty in Wyoming. That interested him.
Now, you mentioned that you have that script to The Conquering Horse. What type of screenwriter was Cimino? I haven't seen any of his scripts. Was he a very wordy, verbose writer, or was he very economical?
No, he certainly wasn't economical in any way at all. He was quite overblown in the stage directions, and particularly the script he wrote of The Fountainhead, you know, the Ayn Rand book.
Right.
When he wrote the script of that, he equaled the kind of expansive operaticness of the novel in the stage directions. I mean, actually, comparing the various scripts, Heaven's Gate is actually quite a spare script. Conquering Horse, which was one of the first scripts he wrote, that's quite overblown and kind of Native American-y.
Now, one of the things with Heaven's Gate that surprised me so much reading your book is that the pre-production period was so fast. I think you describe it as like not much more than 4 months. So why the rush to get that movie going? And do you think that hurt the film?
No. I mean, what was extraordinary about Cimino was that he worked harder than anybody else, for one thing. The Deer Hunter, for example, they began writing the script. And again, as you know, there's a lot of controversy about who actually wrote the script of The Deer Hunter as well. The script of The Deer Hunter began being written in November 1976. The film was meant to go into production in March 77. They did delay it by 3 months in the end, but essentially that went into production within 6 months. I mean, you can do it. It's just very labor intensive. And of course, it's expensive. I mean, it's unbelievable you could do it. Unbelievable. And I don't think it affected the film. What it affected was the budget.
Michael Cimino, the Academy Award-winning director of The Deer Hunter, the Academy Award-winning film, looks now to another period in America's turbulent past, another time of hope and courage. Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate. They came, those who were starving for freedom, those who hungered for adventure, young and strong, building something to believe in. With reckless pride and bold vision and blind faith, they came to Heaven's Gate. With hopes and dreams and guns and prayers, they came. Heroes who knew not all they stood for, but still stood tall and straight. All to seek that glory called America in the glow of Heaven's Gate.
Another interesting thing about that during that pre-production period was the casting of the film.
Yeah.
And it presented some challenges to everyone, particularly the role of Ella, the female part in the film. A number of major Hollywood actresses were considered for the role, you say in the book, but it ultimately went to Isabelle Huppert, who was barely known in the States at the time. So why was Cimino so fixated on casting Isabelle Huppert?
Well, he was actually very, very good at casting. The problem was that contractually, Chris Christopherson, he was paid, I think, $850,000, which is a lot of money then, but he'd just done A Star is Born, so he was sort of hot. He had contractual first billing. So if, you wanted, as I think they did, I mean, there were the usual suspects at that time. Jane Fonda, Diane Keaton, even allegedly Raquel Welch. I don't know if that's actually true, but somebody told me that. If you're going to get Diane Keaton or Jane Fonda, A, they're going to want to be paid more than Chris Christopherson because they're better known than Chris Christopherson. But more than that, they're not going to take second billing to him. Even though his is the larger part, Barbara Streisand didn't take second billing to Chris Christopherson on Star is Born. They wouldn't do. So I think they tried a lot of people and it didn't work. And he was very instinctive. He says he discovered Isabelle Huppert. Joanne Corelli, the producer, says she discovered, but as she and Cimino were together, it doesn't really matter who discovered her. He was very, very instinctive about casting. And it was certainly counterintuitive to get Isabelle Huppert. The fact that she was foreign, it concerned some people that she was French. But as the whole movie is about immigrants from all over the place in Europe, I don't see why you shouldn't have her being foreign, because everybody else in the movie is foreign, apart from the stock growers and Christopherson and John Hurt. And it was a very counterintuitive thing. She was 28, maybe, but the age doesn't matter. He was brilliant at casting. And though everybody kicked up the most incredible fuss about her, I think they had realized by this point, because this was really close to shooting, They realized they would not be able to get a star, an American star, but they would have taken an American not-so-famous person to play the part. And they were horrified when it was somebody French who couldn't speak English very well. And Stephen Bach, you'll have read Final Cut, is so unpleasant about Isabelle Huppert. He calls her, she has a face like a potato. She looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. And Cimino, as usual, outmaneuvered everybody and got her. And the fact is, she is brilliant. She doesn't look like a Pillsbury Doughboy, whatever that is. She certainly doesn't have a face like a potato. She's gorgeous.
She's beautiful. She's so emotional in the film. She's like really the emotional center.
It is a brilliant performance. And he knew it, and nobody else knew it, and he was right.
It's wonderful how later in life she remains such a champion of his. In interviews, she's always speaks so reverentially of him as a artist and as a man.
They were very, very close. Very, very close. And she stayed loyal to him forever, as did Chris Christopherson and Jeff Bridges. All actors generally really, really loved working with Cimino.
A lot of the film is shot in Kalispell, Montana,
Yes.
where sort of the majority of the movie is set there. What was the relationship like during production between the production itself and the residents of Kalispell? Because they were there for so long.
They were there for 7 months. The reason they wanted to shoot around there was because Kalispell is one of the closest towns to Glacier National Park. So Kalispell, they wanted to use. And again, this goes back to the budget. There is a perfectly good railway station in Kalispell, but Cimino didn't like it. It wasn't kind of spectacular. And Gary Wunderwald, who was the Montana Film Commissioner, he found Wallace, Idaho, and he obviously wasn't particularly keen that it was in Idaho because he was the film commissioner for Montana, but it was about 3 hours drive away. And it was an amazing location because the train comes right by the town, which it doesn't in Kalispell. But, of course, that made the whole thing more expensive because they had budgeted to do it at Kalispell Station. And then the whole saga about the train, there was a particular train he wanted, the one that had been used in Cat Ballou. And it didn't, the gauge, I'm not a railway expert, but the gauge was wrong. And it was in Colorado or somewhere. So they had to put the train on the train to get it to Wallace. And that wasn't budgeted for. This is why the budget went up and up and up and up and up. And as I say, but Clint Eastwood, who Cimino had a very good relationship on Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, Clint Eastwood would have just said, you can't use that train. You can't use Wallace, Idaho. Make do with Kalispell. That's what producers say to directors. But not in this case.
So Cimino's relationship with his producers was definitely fraught with issues. But what was his relationship like with his DP, Vilmos Zsigmond?
Well, I mean, Vilmos Zsigmond is, I think, one of the single greatest cameramen in America. I mean, he wasn't American, he's Czechoslovak, I think. He did McCabe and Mrs. Miller, which is one of my absolute favorite Westerns in the world. And he was brilliant. And the look, I mean, Deer Hunter is great, but the cinematography on Heaven's Gate is unbelievable. Unbelievable. And they had some ups and downs, but they got on really, really well. And the relationship kind of broke down afterwards because Cimino, who was very spiky and wanted to own everything, I mean, he wanted to be responsible for everything. Like he wanted to be responsible for the script, even if he wasn't responsible for the script. And of course, he couldn't exactly be responsible for the cinematography because he wasn't a DOP. But he felt, because, you know, the two things that people loved about the movie, as far as anybody loved anything about the movie when it came out, was the cinematography and David Mansfield's music. And later on, Cimino felt that Vilmos had taken too much credit. And he said something, I can't quite remember. He said, they call themselves directors of photography. Sorry, they're just lighting cameramen. They just come on and shoot the movie. I've been on the movie for a year before they even come on, and I'm on the movie a year after, blah, blah, blah. So they did kind of fall out.
Now, to me, one of the most misguided things about Heaven's Gate was that after shooting this gorgeous-looking movie, as you just described it, Cimino decided to use that filter, that brown-looking, muddy filter over the image.
That was... You're absolutely right. And when I say the thing people loved about the movie, I'm really talking about when the movie was restored, they loved it. I mean, it was so long ago that I saw that version, I can't quite remember the look of it, but you're absolutely right. It looked odd. It was like a nicotine haze over everything, a kind of yellow nicotine haze. And, I think he wanted it to look like an old print of the Old West. And it certainly was not a great decision to do it that way. And he always said that he was forced into doing it because they didn't have enough time. But that's simply not true. There was nothing about the original version of Heaven's Gate when it came out that he didn't have total control over. And because it was such a disaster doing timing the movie, if that's what I mean, in that way. He then, of course, didn't take responsibility for it and said it wasn't really his decision, but everything was his decision. And that, in a way, was one of the reasons why the movie was reevaluated when Criterion did that director's cut, which isn't really a director's cut. It's more or less exactly the same version as it was when it opened before it was withdrawn. I mean, there's like a minute's difference in it. One of the reasons it was reevaluated was because they took that nicotine haze off, so nobody had really seen how beautiful it was. And it is, well, you've seen it. It's just literally incredible.
Yeah, every image looks like a painting. The colors are perfect. The lighting is perfect.
Yeah.
I just feel like if he hadn't made that decision early on to use that filter, a few more critics might not have.
No, I think you're right. I mean, one of the critics, I think Roger Ebert, said, it is the ugliest looking film I've ever seen. And that's slightly unfair. It's like a concept that doesn't quite work.
And so the battle begins between King Arthur and his illegitimate son Mordred in Excalibur, the latest retelling of the legend of King Arthur, and one of 5 movies we'll be reviewing this week on Sneak Previews. Across the aisle from me, Roger Ebert, film critic of the Chicago Sun-Times.
And across the aisle from me is Gene Siskel, film critic of the Chicago Tribune. In addition to Excalibur, we'll also be reviewing Modern Romance, the new comedy by Albert Brooks. We'll take a look at what many people are calling the movie event of the year, the resurrected 1927 classic Napoleon. And we'll take a look at what many people are calling the movie non-event of the year, Heaven's Gate. But first, Gene starts with the new Sylvester Stallone thriller, Nighthawks.
Now, you've mentioned David Mansfield's score, which, of course, as you said, is a masterpiece. But as you explain it in the book, he didn't start out as the film's composer. In fact, they approached other famous Hollywood composers. So how did Mansfield end up in that role, and who else did they talk to?
Okay, they talked to John Williams was going to do it originally. And then he, I think, was given the job of running the Boston Pops, and so he couldn't do it. They talked to Ennio Morricone. I think at one point they might have talked to John Barry. But Cimino's producer, Joanne Corelli, who was more than his producer, but let's call her the producer, because she was the producer, but apart from everything else she is a very brilliant person, but she is difficult in lots of ways. And she had found David Mansfield. I mean, what Cimino wanted to do, he wanted to create a band of 6-7 people. I can't remember how many they actually are in the thing. But Joanne really got all that together. She's very good at music. She found T-Bone Burnett, who's famous now, David Mansfield, Stephen Bruton, who was part of Chris Christopherson's touring band, and I can't remember the other ones. But they were all like proper musicians, because normally on a movie, to do a sequence like that, you'd get some people who could play instruments, but they would be just miming to somebody else's track. But in this case, they had recorded the track. I mean, it wasn't done live. They were, in a sense, miming to it, but they were miming to their own music. They had put it together. And he is a consummate musician, David Mansfield. He was like a child prodigy. He played like 17 instruments. And, he went on to play with the most incredible array of people. I mean, Joanne Corelli found him when he was playing with Bob Dylan on the Rolling Thunder Review and brought him to the location. And she, in a sense, cast that band. And when they were in LA, they couldn't find somebody to do the music that they wanted. Cimino had wanted a traditional John Williams, Elmer Bernstein-y, big country, magnificent, like a traditional big Western score that everybody does. And it was Joanne who came up with the concept of kind of less is more. And there was a lot of music around the film, and David's band endlessly played in the evenings in bars. So the music was sort of part of it. And he had heard a lot of the songs and music that the immigrants had played. And when they were back in LA, he just began tinkering with some of the music he'd heard, and he had a studio, and he laid down some tracks, and Corelli gave them to Cimino, who began fiddling around with them. And it gradually, without a sort of formal decision, it became clear that that was the music and that David was doing it. And it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
So now, the studio actually considered replacing Cimino at one point during production, and you managed to figure out that it was most likely Norman Jewison that they approached.
Yes.
So
yes.
Why didn't they end up replacing him?
Well, it's problematic replacing directors, particularly on this kind of movie. I mean, it's expensive because you've essentially got to close down the movie for a couple of weeks, find another director, get the new director up to speed. So, it's not cheap. But if it's like a modest movie, it's not that expensive either. But on this, one of the problems was that this was sold as a great movie by a great director, an auteur movie, a personal statement from Michael Cimino. That was the attraction for United Artists. This was a great movie by a great director. It's hard to have a great movie by a great director if you sack the director. It's an auteur movie without an auteur. You could do it, but it would be like replacing Stanley Kubrick off Barry Lyndon, sacking David Lean off Lawrence of Arabia, sacking Martin Scorsese off Raging Bull. It's hard to do, though you can do it. And the problem really is, who are you going to get to direct it? Obviously, you could get somebody to direct it, because if you were an untried director, it would be like the biggest chance in the world to suddenly take over a big movie. But it's difficult, because if you've got this great statement movie, you don't want to hack completing it. But if you went to Norman Jewison, why would Norman Jewison want to do it? Because if the movie's a success, they'll all say it was Cimino's success. And if it's a failure, they'll all say that Norman Jewison's ruined it. So, and okay, you could throw money at him and offer him such a ludicrous amount of money that he might do it. But those kind of directors, I'm not saying they don't do things for money, but they have a kind of reputation. And also you have a problem the cast, who were all very loyal, the cast and crew who were very loyal to Cimino. You know, I mean, of course, the cast and crew are all under contract, so you could force the actors to work with another director contractually. But that's tough too. You know, actors are vulnerable creatures. And the other thing was that as they were shooting with 5 cameras half the time, the amount of footage they shot was unbelievable. And Cimino, who was brilliant, he knew what he had shot and he knew how he would cut together. I mean, for example, the final battle at the end, it goes on for an hour or whatever it goes on for. He had 5 or 6 cameras all the way through that. It took a month to shoot. And it isn't like a dialogue scene where you know which bit of dialogue goes next. It's just an amorphous mass of footage of, you know, carriages and horses and guns. Nobody would know how to put it together other than him. Mm-hmm. So that was really why they couldn't.
Now, speaking of the editing, where you're talking about right now, when Cimino cut the film very secretively, he sort of didn't have anybody else but him and a series of editors. So when he finally put together that rough cut for the studio, the first time that they saw it, what was the response from them? Like, I think you said it was like 5+ hours or something.
It was 5.5 hours. The reaction was not good. I mean, understandably, they hadn't signed up to a 5.5 hour Western. I mean, at 3 hours and 40 minutes, I mean, I love the movie, but it's slow. They were horrified. And Penny Shaw, who was his assistant editor, who was, again, somebody who was incredibly helpful to me, she was with him all the time. I said to Penny, who had seen, I said, well, what was the longer version like? And she said, it was longer.
And then when the film finally opened, the reviews, of course, were brutal. So they were so bad that Cimino requested the film be pulled so that he could recut it.
And that was entirely his decision. That wasn't United Artists forcing that on him.
So what impact did that reaction have on him emotionally? What was his state of mind at the time?
Well, I think he was absolutely devastated. I mean, that's not a surprise. Wouldn't you be if you got those reviews? And in fact, I think it was the biggest mistake anybody made was to withdraw the movie. For one thing, nobody had ever done it before. I mean, it was unheard of. It was on for like 3 days. That was it. And it was withdrawn. They cancelled the LA premiere. It was never shown in LA. And it was odd for Cimino, who did have total confidence in himself and what he did, rightly, because he was brilliant. He didn't have doubts, generally. And he had doubts, which was very unlike him, which is why he kind of panicked. But it was disastrous because it was such an extraordinary thing for a studio to do, to withdraw a $40 million movie. It had never been done. So the story, I mean, the bad reviews were the bad reviews, but they were on the arts pages, and suddenly it became a news story.
Right.
And it was crazy because United Artists knew what was in the footage. God knows they'd seen the 5.5 hour version. It wasn't like there was something else that hadn't been put in the movie that they could sort of salvage and put in the movie. They knew what was there. And so what you were going to get was, like Penny said, what's the long version like longer? What's the short version like shorter? And he didn't cut out any scenes. He shortened everything. So the story seems confusing, but actually the story is quite confusing in the long version. I don't mean that. There are lots of movies that are a bit confusing. They can still be brilliant, which I think it is. But so I don't know what they thought was going to happen with the short version. There were so many things the length was one of the 5,000 things people hated about the movie. It certainly wasn't the only thing they hated about the movie. I don't know what they thought they were going to achieve. And the reviews were terrible for the shortened version. You know, I'm trying to think of them now. They're in the book. You know, like, this is like a fat man who's gone on a diet but doesn't look any different. Those were the kind of reviews. And I think if they had stuck to their guns, not withdrawn the movie, it still would have been a huge flop. But they would have had a kind of integrity.
Yeah, it puts out a different message to the world.
Exactly.
And now, speaking of the message that he would put out there, Cimino's relationship with the Hollywood press definitely didn't do him any favors on this project.
No, not at all.
That insisting on a total media blackout during production angered a lot of them, I think. So what effect did that relationship with the press have on the film's reputation?
Well, you have to be careful about publicity on a movie because you have to control it. And in the old days, when there was more money, there would be like private jets, flying 10 hand-picked journalists up to the location where, they were, probably laid on some hookers for the, I don't know what, they were typical press junkets. And with a lot of booze and great food and expensive hotels. And it was like a kind of schmooze fest. So that was what journalists were used to. And this was a big, important movie. Everybody wanted to write about it. And it was like a toy they weren't allowed to have. And they turned very nasty. Journalists always feel they're doing the movie a favor. They weren't given the chance to do that. So all the stories, they began concentrating on the stories that were leaking out. It's hard to keep a secret in Hollywood. Everybody knew about the budget. Everybody presumed that Cimino had gone mad, that he was like Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now. He had gone mad upriver. And those were kind of the stories they printed, which were all rumor and in fact, which was one of the great things to discover when I went to Kalispell. Everybody had a lovely time on the movie. They all really liked Cimino. It was hard work, but they were all really well paid. It's hard work doing movies. They all loved Cimino. He was relaxed. They all had a good time with him because he wasn't struggling to keep up with the schedule because he didn't have a schedule. He just did what he wanted to do, and he was very relaxed about it.
Right. I think you say something like it wasn't the production that was out of control. It was just the budget that was out of control.
Yes, exactly.
The actual crew were enjoying the process.
Everybody had a great time. I mean, when I went to Kalispell, it was clear to me that of the people I talked to there's a lot of people, nothing as exciting had ever happened to them before, and it hasn't happened to them again. But all the crew, they were locals who were extras and stuff. But the crew who I talked to, they all had a wonderful time. And in the book, which is one of the nice, in the book, they gave me photographs, you've seen them, of Cimino kind of by the swimming pool, Cimino joking around. And nobody, in LA, they just thought it was like Jonestown. That all these people were in a kind of compound and weren't allowed to leave and were having a terrible time, but it wasn't like that at all. But so they didn't, it was a big mistake to do that because nobody was rooting for the movie.
After reading your book, I feel like there's a sort of a spiritual kinship of sorts between Cimino and Sam Peckinpah. Both men were uncompromising macho filmmakers who, almost on principle, rejected any type of input or involvement from the studios, to the point where it ultimately sabotaged a lot of their favorite projects. So is there something to that connection between the two of them, do you think?
You're absolutely right. I mean, as it happens, Sam Peckinpah is my favorite director. And I was just looking at the new Blu-ray of Major Dundee, where they talk about the restored footage. It's about 10 or 15 minutes. It doesn't really add that much to it because all the big stuff has been lost. But, The Wild Bunch, I think Wild Bunch is a much better film than Heaven's Gate, really. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, Junior Bonner, Cable Hogue. I mean, I think The Wild Bunch is probably one of the 10 best movies ever made. It's absolutely brilliant. And, of course, it's what Hollywood does. The one movie where Peckinpah did it absolutely the way he wanted to do it is his best film, which is Major Dundee was recut. All the sagas of Pat Garrett. Though actually I think there's endless different versions of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, sort of the director's cut, sort of this, sort of that. They're all brilliant. They're different. They're all brilliant. And of course, with sorry, I'm digressing on Peckinpah, but you shouldn't have mentioned Peckinpah because it will make me digress. Of course, there never was a final cut of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, because what he often did, he just washed his hands of it and walked out, and he left his editors to sort of put it together. So there never really was a director's
sort of like
cut
Orson Welles would do that
Kid.
too in a lot of...
Exactly, just walk out. But Cimino admired Peckinpah a lot, and they were friends. And when they were shooting, there are various different versions of the story. This was 1979 when they were filming it. Peckinpah's career had nosedived. He died in about 84, I think. He had done Convoy, which was such a disaster, Cross of Iron, which is actually one of that wartime war movie in Germany. It's a great
The
film.
Osterman Weekend, that didn't really...
Well, let's not even go to the Osterman Weekend, which is just a terrible, terrible, terrible film. But Cimino got him up to Kalispell to do some second Unity stuff. And the various stories, one was that he was drunk all the time and they couldn't get him to do anything. The other story was that Peckinpah had gone up there, but then Cimino never spoke to him. Who knows? And they did have a fallout. I didn't put it in the book. I'm not quite sure why I didn't put it in the book. I don't know why I didn't put it in, but there you go, I didn't. But they were great friends when they were friends and did admire each other a lot.
Now Sam Peckinpah, the director who unleashed the Wild Bunch, takes a hard new look at two old friends, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. They were legends in their own time.
Times have changed. Times, maybe. Not me.
Now, the other major book about the making of Heaven's Gate is one you've already mentioned, Final Cut. So what are your thoughts on that book?
Well, firstly, it's a fabulous book in terms of gossip. It's one of the great reads of all time because it's so bitchy and nasty. And you know how we all like to read bitchy, nasty things. It's fun. Even when I first read it, I thought there was something off about it. For one thing, I don't know when you last read it, but it's long, and there are pages and pages of conversations with people. Like he will go into, we had a meeting and he said that and I said this and they said that. I don't know how he could possibly know. I mean, how he could possibly remember. I mean, obviously, if you have a meeting, you can remember what happened at the meeting, but you can't remember like everything everybody said for pages. It's also self-serving. I mean, the great books about the making of movies are Picture, the Lillian Ross book about Red Badge of Courage, Julie Salamon's book about the making of Bonfire of the Vanities, the Brian De Palma movie, which is called The Devil's Candy.
Right.
They're great books, but they are books written by journalists and they are impartial. Whereas this book, the Bark book, is not impartial at all. And while he certainly doesn't deny his mistakes, but he subtly distances himself. It's hard to define exactly what I've found bogus about it, but he sort of takes responsibility, but sort of doesn't, because he puts a lot of the blame on David Field, who was the other. There were two executives in charge of equal status. They were joint heads of production at United Artists. David Field was the other one, who has never talked, and I did get him to talk. And you've read the book, you've seen his version of events.
Very much so.
And I happen to believe his version of events, actually. And I think he was very unfairly treated. And all the stuff I quote from the book, I mean, Bach hardly ever went to Kalispell. And if you read the book, you'd think somehow he was there all the time, but he wasn't. He went maybe twice. David Field went a lot. But they were joint heads of production. It wasn't more David Field's. In fact, Stephen Bach had been the person who got Cimino to United Artists. And David's very open about it. He said, we weren't Darrell F. Zanuck. They were young and they weren't that experienced. And it was difficult because United Artists had let Joanne Corelli produce the movie. Now, Joanne is really a brilliant person, and she is really tough, and she would have been a brilliant producer. For the most difficult director in the world, she would have been brilliant, but not for Cimino. They were too close. Their relationship, their mysterious relationship, they were so entwined that she couldn't produce it. And I say in the book, everybody's wives are credited as producers. They're called vanity credits. And Robin Williams's wife, who had been his children's nanny, and the marriage broke up and he married her, she produced 5 of his movies. But she wasn't really the producer. The credits were produced by, I won't call her Robin Williams's nanny, I can't remember her name, produced by, and. With this, there was no and. Of course, Cimino hated producers, and on Deer Hunter, he saw off some producers, and he might have done the same on Heaven's Gate, but United Artists didn't even try to put in, because studio executives aren't producers in that sense. They're looking after the business of the studio. And I always found it extraordinary the United Artists didn't insist on produced by Joanne Corelli and somebody else, but they didn't. And so you had the production manager, the line producer, who was a guy called Charlie Elton, who had worked with Cimino on commercials in the 60s. So they were friends. So there were no checks and balances. That's what a producer does. You have to rein in the director. And in fairness to Joanne, everybody presumed that she was just his girlfriend. If she was his girlfriend, who knows? They had such a mysterious relationship. And she just let him do what he wanted. In fact, that's really not true. And I go into that in the book. It's not true. She did her best to try to control him. But as United Artists weren't giving her any backup, it was almost impossible. But she did try. She really, really did try.
So, to wrap things up, how did your personal opinion of Michael Cimino change over time while you were writing this book? Did you come to see him in a different way than you did when you first started the project?
The only thing in life I know about is movies. I can't do Presidents of the United States or Kings and Queens of England, but I have a kind of weird Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man, kind of nerdy. I can reel off people's credits. I can reel off the cameraman on the last 16 Clint Eastwood movies. I mean, we won't do it, it'll take up too much time. So I did know a lot about Cimino, but I knew about, the transformation, let's call it, in his later years. I knew about his strange relationship with Joanne. I'd read Final Cut, so I knew that much about it. And I found it quite moving, actually, that he was kind of more vulnerable than I had thought. I just thought he was a kind of tough bastard like John Ford, but he wasn't really. Strangely vulnerable. And I felt a bit sorry for him in a way. The structure of the book, which is basically, this is his childhood, this is what he said, this is what I believe, and then going all the way round and coming back to the end where I did talk to the family. And it wasn't at all what he had said. And, like he didn't see his mother for 27 years at the end of her life, even though she adored him. But he said that his family was horrible, and they weren't. And I can't really explain why you would reinvent your past. I mean, I can see reasons why you want to have a more glamorous past than the boring pasts we all have. But it was more than that. And I wish I could answer that. And so in a sense, for me, that was the kind of slight sort of rosebud moment where you go and you find that his family all loved him, but he rejected them as opposed to the other way round. And I found not that many, because there weren't that many to find, like 3, 4, 5 people who loved him, like FX. loved him unconditionally. I find it a very moving story, actually. Sad, but moving. And I suppose what I feel is that failure is more interesting than success. And I don't mean failure. I mean the fact that your life hasn't quite lived up to what you thought your life was going to be. And that thing, it's sort of like Orson Welles, where after Citizen Kane for Welles and Deer Hunter for Cimino, they had the world in their hands and they let it slip away. You know, I don't particularly want to read a biography of Steven Spielberg, you know, whose life certainly has turned out exactly the way he hoped it would, in a way that Cimino didn't. It's not interesting. I'm not saying he's not a great filmmaker and that if he called me up and said, would you like to have a drink with me, I would cancel this interview in a second and go. But it's not interesting.
No, it's like why... Like somebody like John Ford, there's a director whose personality is so abrasive and so like
exactly,
where you really
a Hitchcock as well.
Definitely, I see what you mean. So now that the book is about to be published, what would you like readers to take away from this experience of reading it? What do you hope it leaves them with?
I mean, some of the things I wanted to correct, particularly the thing about he bankrupted the studio, which is completely untrue. Completely untrue. It's all the stuff in the book. I mean, it just isn't true at all. And he was misunderstood, misrepresented, and unfairly treated, though a lot of that was his own fault. So I'm not exonerating him. But he was a spiky, complex, difficult person. And I don't understand why people expect artists to be nice people. You know, do you think Picasso was a nice guy? I bet he wasn't. I bet John Ford wasn't. Do you want to have a cozy supper with Erich von Stroheim? You know, I don't know why people expect them to be nice people. And Cimino wasn't really a nice person in that sense, because he was totally directed to achieving what he wanted to achieve. And I think it's very sad and human that in the end he didn't achieve the things he felt he should have achieved and the things I feel he should have achieved. But as I say, you can't blame everybody else for that. A lot of it you have to blame him for.
Well, that comes across in the book. It's definitely not an apologist's book, no.
No.
Well, Charles, I just want to thank you again for speaking with me today about your new book. It's a real gift to fans of Michael Cimino. There's just so much in it that we haven't talked about here. The making of the Deer Hunter, his family life that you've mentioned here. There's so much more to get into. But in the meantime, I just want to thank you again for being on the show.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
It has been called the most controversial motion picture of its time. It is the most talked about and written about film of the decade. Now, from the director of The Deer Hunter, United Artists presents Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate. The story of Jim Averill. He was born into the world of the rich and powerful, but his heart and dreams were with the people. Heaven's Gate. The story of a man's love for a woman, for a people, for a land, for a spirit that would never die. Chris Christopherson in Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate.
Well, that wraps up our Heaven's Gate episode. But before we let you go, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find us at Western Podcast. That's at, as in the at symbol, Western Podcast, all one word. Tell us your thoughts on Heaven's Gate, or suggest other films that you'd like us to cover on future episodes. And if you enjoy our podcast and want to help support it, the best way to do that is by subscribing to it on whatever platform you use. Simply click the subscribe button and you'll never miss an episode. Until next time, I'm Matthew Chernov.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson. And you've been listening to How the West Was Cast.
Well, that was our show. We thank you kindly for listening and hope you'll come back again real soon. Till then, keep your saddle oiled and your guns greased. We'll be seeing you.